Step away from the register. We need to ask about your authorization to work here.
I work here. I've been here 6 years. What is this about?
Are you a United States citizen?
Yes, I was born in Cleveland, Ohio. Why are you asking me this here in front of customers?
Then provide documentation proving your legal right to work.
This is harassment.
The barcode scanner froze mid-beep in her hand. For 6 years, Maya Sterling had owned this register. 6 years of small talk, scanning groceries, and building a life in the heart of Columbus. But at exactly 6:43 p.m. on the 12th of April 2025, the routine shattered. Now, 2 federal agents stood like stone walls between her and a line of weekend shoppers who were already reaching for their phones. The harsh fluorescent lights of Prime Foods cast clinical shadows across Register 4 as the evening rush ground to a halt. Every lens in the building, from the overhead CCTV to the handheld screens of witnesses, was locked onto the confrontation about to unfold. Maya, a 27-year-old pillar of her community, was about to be hauled away in front of the very people she served. They didn't know it yet. But this footage would soon become the smoking gun in a massive $2 million civil rights battle. If you're tired of seeing authority used as a weapon of profiling, hit that like button and tell me in the comments which city you're watching from. If you're new here, subscribe and turn on notifications because you won't want to miss our next deep dive into what happens when the system targets the wrong person and pays the ultimate price. Let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments below. The official deposition of the events occurring on the 12th of April 2025 begins not with the clinking of handcuffs, but with the rhythmic, mundane beep of a Honeywell scanner at Prime Foods in Columbus, Ohio. Maya Sterling, a 27-year-old woman whose life was a testament to Midwest resilience, stood at Register 4, a station she had occupied with unwavering reliability for 6 consecutive years. Born and raised in the working-class neighborhoods of Cleveland, Maya was the daughter of a school librarian and a retired postal worker people who taught her that in America, your papers were your shield and your hard work was your bond. She had moved to Columbus to seek a fresh start, balancing her full-time role as a senior cashier with the quiet responsibility of supporting her younger brother's tuition at Ohio State. She was the kind of employee who remembered which customers needed double bagging and which ones were having a rough week. On this particular Saturday, the store was a chaotic symphony of weekend shoppers, the air thick with the smell of rotisserie chicken and floor wax. Maya was deep in the zone, her hands moving with practiced precision, oblivious to the fact that her personal history and constitutional rights were about to be interrogated by the heavy boots of federal authority. On the other side of this inevitable collision was Special Agent Miller of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE. Miller was a man whose personnel file was a patchwork of aggressive enforcement commendations and whispered complaints of overreach. In the months leading up to the spring of 2025, Miller had developed a reputation in the Columbus field office for a zero-tolerance approach that often blurred the lines of probable cause. Internal reports, later surfaced in discovery, suggested a pattern of targeting service industry businesses with high concentrations of minority employees, often acting on anonymous tips that lacked basic corroboration. Miller possessed a bureaucratic arrogance, a belief that the badge granted him the right to demand proof of existence from anyone who didn't fit his internal image of a native. He viewed the Fourth Amendment not as a barrier, but as a technicality to be bypassed in the name of administrative efficiency. At exactly 1843, the digital clock on the store's CCTV feed flickered as Miller and his partner, Agent Vance, adjusted their tactical vests and cut through the crowd toward Register 4, their presence acting like a cold front moving through a warm room. The atmosphere at the checkout line soured instantly. Customers, sensing the shift in energy, began to stall, their eyes darting between the silver badges and Maya's confused expression. Miller didn't wait for a lull in the transaction. He stepped into Maya's personal space, his hand resting near his utility belt, effectively pinning her behind the counter. The scanner in Maya's hand froze mid-beep as she looked up from a carton of eggs. Miller's voice was devoid of empathy, a cold, mechanical command that echoed off the linoleum. "Step away from the register. We need to ask about your authorization to work here," Miller barked, his eyes scanning her face, not for recognition, but for signs of submission. Maya felt the heat of 100 stares prickling her skin, the humiliation immediate and suffocating. She didn't move, her fingers still gripping the plastic handle of the scanner. "I work here. I've been here 6 years. What is this about?" she replied, her voice steady despite the rapid drumming of her heart. She was a tax-paying citizen in her own city, yet she was being treated like a ghost in the machine. Miller didn't flinch, his partner moving to block the exit of the aisle, creating a makeshift interrogation cell in the middle of the grocery store. "Are you a United States citizen?" Miller demanded, his tone rising to ensure the surrounding crowd heard the implication. The question felt like a physical blow to Maya, a denial of her birthright. "Yes, I was born in Cleveland, Ohio." "Why are you asking me this here in front of customers?" she challenged, her indignation finally surfacing. She looked past Miller at the shoppers, many of whom had already raised their smartphones, the lenses catching the glare of the fluorescent lights. The store manager, a man named Henderson, began hurrying over from the back office, but Miller ignored him entirely, focusing his predatory gaze on Maya. "Then provide documentation proving your legal right to work," Miller countered, refusing to acknowledge her statement of birth. He knew she didn't carry a birth certificate or a passport while scanning groceries. The demand was a trap designed to justify a detention. Maya's grip tightened on the counter, the injustice of the moment crystallizing in her mind. "This is harassment," she stated firmly, her voice captured clearly by the store's overhead microphone and a dozen different recording apps. The standoff lasted less than 3 minutes, but for those watching, it felt like an eternity. Miller signaled to Vance, and the clink of metal against metal signaled the end of the verbal exchange. Despite Maya's clean record, her years of service, and her clear, English-spoken assertion of citizenship, the administrative suspicion of a rogue agent was enough to override her liberty. Henderson arrived just as Miller reached across the counter to grab Maya's arm. "You can't do this." "She's a citizen," Henderson shouted, but he was brushed aside with a threat of interference with a federal investigation. Maya went stiff, a mixture of terror and crystalline anger washing over her. She was led away from Register 4, leaving a half-scanned basket of groceries and a frozen computer screen behind. As she was escorted through the automatic doors and into the cooling April air, the last thing she saw was the glowing red lights of the recording phones. A modern-day Greek chorus witnessing a citizen being disappeared by the state in the middle of a Saturday rush. Chapter 2. The 54-hour erasure. The transition from the vibrant, fluorescent warmth of Prime Foods to the sterile, windowless interior of the Federal Processing Center was a descent into a bureaucratic purgatory that felt engineered to strip a person of their humanity. As the unmarked sedan crossed the perimeter of the Columbus Detention Facility, Maya Sterling watched the familiar skyline of her city dissolve into a blur of chain-link fences and razor wire. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of industrial disinfectant and the low, persistent hum of ventilation fans. Maya was led through a series of heavy steel doors, each one closing with a finality that echoed like a gavel. The processing room was a masterclass in institutional coldness, painted in a shade of beige that seemed designed to absorb light and hope alike. Special Agent Miller, who had remained silent during the drive, handed a thin manila folder to a processing officer who didn't even bother to look up. To these men, Maya was no longer the senior cashier who knew the names of local school teachers, or the sister who sent half her paycheck to an aspiring student at Ohio State. She was a set of data points, a physical body to be cataloged and filed away. The procedural machinery of the state began its work with a clinical indifference that Maya found more terrifying than the initial confrontation at the register. She was ordered to stand before a digital scanner, where an officer grabbed her hands with practiced, rough efficiency, rolling each finger across the glass to capture the ridges of her identity for a database that already suspected her. Next came the intake photograph's front profile, side profile, and 3/4. The camera flash was blinding, momentarily bleaching her vision and leaving her feeling exposed, as if the lens were looking through her skin to find a flaw in her existence. Then came the inventory of her life. One by one, her personal belongings were placed into a clear plastic bag. Her keys with the I Love Cleveland keychain, a modest leather wallet containing $24 and a picture of her parents, and the small gold chain she had worn since her graduation. When the officer reached for her Prime Foods employee badge, Maya felt a sharp pang of grief. That plastic card bearing her smiling face and the title Senior Cashier was the physical proof of her 6 years of service, her taxes paid, and her place in the community. The officer tossed it into the bag with the same disregard he showed for her car keys, effectively severing her last link to the world she had built. Despite the mounting evidence of her citizenship being ignored, Maya refused to surrender to silence. Every time an officer approached, she repeated her birthright like a prayer. I was born in Cleveland. My social security number is in your system. Why am I being processed like this? She demanded, her voice echoing off the cinder block walls. The responses were always the same, a shrug of the shoulders, a mumbled comment about system verification delays, or a cold command to sit down and wait for your turn. It was an administrative wall of stone, a deliberate apathy that served as a secondary form of incarceration. The officers didn't need to argue with her. They simply had to outlast her. They treated her claims of citizenship as a common ruse, a lie they had heard 1,000 times from people who were truly desperate. In this building, the burden of proof had been illegally shifted. She was not innocent until proven guilty. She was an alien until she could produce a piece of paper that was currently locked in a file cabinet miles away in her apartment. By midnight, Maya was moved into a holding cell in the women's wing. The space was a stark box of gray concrete with a single metal bench and a toilet that offered no privacy. The overhead lights never dimmed, a tactic used to erode the sense of time and keep detainees in a state of perpetual disorientation. Maya shared the cell with 4 other women, all of whom wore the same expression of hollowed-out exhaustion. One woman, a mother in her 50s named Elena, sat in the corner, her eyes red from hours of quiet weeping. In the hushed whispers of the night, Maya listened to their stories, accounts of being snatched from bus stops, of being separated from children without a word of explanation, and of being held for weeks without seeing a lawyer. Maya realized then that she was witnessing a shadow system, a world of indefinite holds and procedural necessities that functioned entirely outside the public eye. She watched as a guard ignored a woman's plea for water, and she noted the way the officers spoke to the detainees with a casual cruelty, as if they were talking to cattle rather than human beings. As the hours stretched into the second day, the cold of the cell began to seep into Maya's bones. She had no blanket, no pillow, and the food provided was a tasteless mush served in a cardboard tray. But beneath the physical discomfort, a new sensation was taking root, a cold, analytical clarity. Maya was no longer just a victim. She was a witness. She began to mentally catalog every violation she saw. She memorized the name on the badge of the guard who laughed at a detainee's broken English. She noted the exact time the mandatory medical check was skipped. She kept a mental tally of how many times her request for a phone call was denied. She realized that her detention was not an accident, it was the process itself. The system was designed to break a person's spirit through humiliation and wait times, making the act of being processed a punishment in its own right. As she sat on that metal bench, her back aching and her eyes burning from the fluorescent glare, Maya Sterling made a silent vow. She would not let these 54 hours be erased. She would carry the cold of this room, the indifference of these men, and the stories of the women around her back into the light. She was being treated as a woman without a country, but she knew exactly who she was, and she was already preparing the words that would eventually bring this entire beige fortress crumbling down. While Maya Sterling sat in the sensory-deprived silence of her cell, the world outside the concrete walls of the Columbus detention facility was descending into a digital firestorm. The shaky handheld footage captured by a college student at Register 4 had breached the confines of local social media circles within hours, amassing millions of views as it was reshared by civil rights activists and news outlets across the country. The visual of a senior cashier, clearly articulating her place of birth while being manhandled by federal agents, touched a raw nerve in the American psyche. By the second morning of her disappearance, protesters had already begun to gather outside the Prime Foods parking lot, their signs demanding the immediate release of a woman who had become a face for a systemic crisis. Maya's parents, frantic and exhausted after being turned away from the facility's front desk 3 times, finally secured a meeting with Leo Vance, a heavyweight civil rights attorney known for his surgical precision in dismantling law enforcement immunity. Vance didn't just see a victim. He saw a calculated violation of the Fourth Amendment that was too blatant to be accidental. He immediately filed an emergency writ of habeas corpus, but as he worked the phones, he realized the government was playing a dangerous game of administrative hide-and-seek, claiming Maya's file was still in a verification queue that conveniently ignored the reality of her birth certificate sitting on his desk. However, what the federal government and even Leo Vance did not yet know, was that Maya Sterling was not a passive observer of her own tragedy. Deep beneath the rumpled fabric of her Prime Foods uniform, nestled against her chest, was a device that would shift the entire trajectory of the case. Maya had lived a double life for 3 years. To the shoppers in Columbus, she was the friendly face at the register. But in the digital underground, she was the architect of shadow borders, an anonymous, highly encrypted blog that had become a thorn in the side of the Department of Homeland Security. She had spent years meticulously curating stories of ICE overreach, verifying anonymous tips from affected families, and publishing data-driven exposés on the mechanics of racial profiling. She knew the system better than the agents who had arrested her, and she knew its greatest weakness was the truth. Fearing the very retaliation she was now experiencing, Maya had started wearing a high-definition, micro-lens body camera to every shift, a silent insurance policy against a system she knew was eventually coming for someone like her. The device was a marvel of modern surveillance, disguised as a common shirt button and connected to a wafer-thin recording unit taped to her torso. It had remained undetected during the cursory pat-down at the supermarket and the clinical intake process at the facility, largely because the officers had been so blinded by their own biases that they never suspected a grocery store clerk could possess such tactical foresight. As Maya sat on the metal bench, she could feel the faint, rhythmic warmth of the unit. It had captured every second of the confrontation. Agent Miller's predatory sneer, his refusal to look at her Ohio driver's license, the physical force used when she stood her ground, and the casual, racist jokes exchanged between the agents in the front seat of the sedan during the drive to the facility. It had even recorded the ambient audio of the detention center, the screams of separated families in the distance, and the administrative indifference of the guards who told her that her kind always claimed to be from Cleveland. When Leo Vance finally secured a 30-minute legal visitation on the third day, the air in the interview room was thick with the scent of stale coffee and desperation. He began to explain the legal hurdles, the qualified immunity defenses the agents would surely raise, and the difficulty of proving intent in a racial profiling case. Maya waited for him to finish, her face a mask of calm that startled the seasoned lawyer. She leaned across the table, her voice a low, steady whisper that barely carried to the surveillance mic in the corner. "They think they took everything from me, Leo," she said, her eyes burning with a fierce, quiet intelligence. "They took my keys, my wallet, and my badge. But they didn't take the truth." She reached into the collar of her shirt, carefully unpinning the device she had guarded with her life for the last 54 hours. As she placed the micro unit on the table, she revealed her identity as the founder of Shadow Borders. She explained that this wasn't just a recording of a bad arrest. It was a digital archive of a federal crime. The evidence wasn't just in the room anymore, it was a ticking time bomb. The agents hadn't just detained a cashier, they had kidnapped a whistleblower, and they had done it all on high-definition video. The federal courthouse in downtown Columbus stood as a neoclassical monolith of justice, its limestone pillars reflecting a pale, uncertain sun as an emergency hearing was convened under the intense scrutiny of a nation. Maya Sterling entered the courtroom not in her stained Prime Foods uniform, but in a borrowed blazer. Her posture rigid despite the exhaustion shadowing her eyes after 54 hours of systemic degradation. Across the aisle, the government's legal team sat with an air of practiced indifference, led by a Department of Justice attorney who attempted to frame the entire incident as a regrettable but necessary procedural delay inherent in modern immigration enforcement. Special Agent Miller sat behind them, his jaw set in a smug line of perceived immunity, confident that the good faith exception would shield his actions from any meaningful consequence. The air in the gallery was thick with tension, crowded with activists, journalists, and Maya's trembling parents, all waiting for Judge Amelia Thornton to take the bench and decide whether the Fourth Amendment still applied to a woman whose only crime was the color of her skin and a refusal to be intimidated. Leo Vance did not begin with a theatrical oration. Instead, he opened the proceedings with a cold, clinical timeline of bureaucratic failure that dismantled the government's defense before it could even begin. He presented internal logs from the Ohio Bureau of Motor Vehicles and the Social Security Administration, proving that Maya's status as a natural-born citizen of Cleveland was verifiable in less than 3 minutes using any standard federal terminal. He argued with surgical precision that the 54-hour hold was not a result of systemic backlog, as the government claimed, but was a deliberate, punitive measure designed to break a citizen who had dared to assert her rights at Register 4. Your Honor, Vance's voice echoed through the hushed chamber, the government did not lose the ability to verify Miss Sterling's citizenship. They simply lost the desire to do so once they realized she wouldn't bow to their extrajudicial bullying. This wasn't an investigation. It was a kidnapping under the color of law, a manual for state-sponsored retaliation against a person who spoke the truth. The atmosphere shifted from intense to explosive when Vance requested permission to enter a newly discovered digital record into evidence. A heavy silence fell over the room as a technician adjusted the monitors. The government's attorney rose to object, citing procedural surprises. But Judge Thornton, sensing the gravity of the moment, overruled him with a sharp wave of her hand. Then, the screens flickered to life, displaying a high-definition, wide-angle perspective from Maya's hidden camera. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as the footage showed Miller's face from just inches away, his sneering dismissal of Maya's driver's license, the aggressive physical stance he took to corner her behind the register, and most damningly, the audio captured in the back of the transport sedan. The speakers filled with the sound of Miller and Vance, laughing about making an example out of this one because she thought her Cleveland birth certificate made her untouchable. The recording didn't just show a procedural error. It exposed a raw, unfiltered vein of racial animus and premeditated malice. It proved that the agents hadn't detained Maya because they doubted her status, but because they hated her defiance. The climax of the hearing arrived as the video played through the intake process, capturing a guard off camera telling Maya that maybe a few nights in a cell will fix that attitude. Judge Thornton's face, usually a mask of judicial neutrality, flushed with a visible, righteous anger. She leaned forward, her eyes locked onto the government's counsel, with a gaze that promised an institutional reckoning. I have heard many defenses of sovereign immunity in this courtroom, the judge began, her voice low and trembling with a controlled fury. But I have never seen a more flagrant, recorded disregard for the constitutional boundaries of this office. You didn't just ignore the law. You mocked it. You held a United States citizen in a cage for over 2 days while joking about the illegality of your own actions. The judge didn't wait for a rebuttal. She struck her gavel with a sound that felt like a crack of thunder, ordering Maya's immediate and unconditional release from federal custody. She took the unprecedented step of stripping the good faith defense from the record, characterizing the government's conduct as an affront to the dignity of the court and a stain on the federal badge, effectively clearing the path for the massive civil litigation that everyone in the room knew was coming. The aftermath of Judge Thornton's scathing rebuke did not lead to a quiet retreat for Maya Sterling. Instead, it ignited a legal blitzkrieg that would reshape federal enforcement protocols across the Midwest. Within weeks of her release, Leo Vance filed a comprehensive civil rights lawsuit in the U.S. District Court, naming the Department of Homeland Security, the Director of ICE, and agents Miller and Vance as defendants. The complaint was a masterful tapestry of constitutional violations, citing the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable seizure and the Fifth Amendment's guarantee of due process. However, the true weight of the litigation lay in the discovery process. Armed with the high-definition footage from Maya's hidden camera, Vance's team was able to bypass the usual blue wall of silence. They uncovered a trail of internal communications that proved the agents hadn't just made a mistake, they had targeted Prime Foods specifically because of its diverse workforce to meet informal arrest quotas. Facing the prospect of a public trial where Maya's devastating video evidence would be played on repeat for a jury, the federal government's initial posture of defiance crumbled. The Department of Justice, desperate to avoid a precedent-setting verdict that could strip qualified immunity from agents nationwide, opted for a strategic surrender behind closed doors. The settlement was as historic as the violation itself. Maya Sterling was awarded $9.2 million in damages, a figure meticulously calculated to cover not only the 54 hours of her psychological trauma and loss of liberty, but also a massive punitive component designed to serve as a deterrent for future misconduct. Yet, for Maya, the victory was never defined by the dollar amount. The real triumph manifested in the institutional wreckage left in the wake of the settlement. As a direct condition of the agreement, agents Miller and Vance were summarily terminated from federal service. Their careers ended by the very recording they never suspected was running. Furthermore, the Department of Homeland Security was forced to sign a binding consent decree. This mandated a sweeping overhaul of their workplace enforcement standard operating procedures. The new Sterling Protocol required agents to possess articulable probable cause, not just administrative suspicion, before detaining any individual for status verification at a place of business. It also established an independent oversight board to review all workplace raids in the state of Ohio, ensuring that racial profiling was no longer a viable tactic hidden under the guise of national security. The final transformation of the case occurred on the steps of the federal courthouse, exactly 6 months after that fateful Saturday at Register 4. Surrounded by a sea of microphones and cameras, Maya Sterling stood before the nation to deliver a revelation that many in the intelligence community had long feared. She officially stepped out from the digital shadows, announcing that she was the founder and primary author of Shadow Borders. She revealed that the $2 million would be used to transition the blog from an anonymous archive into a fully funded national legal defense fund for victims of enforcement overreach. For 3 years, I documented your abuses from behind a screen, Maya declared, her voice carrying across the plaza with a newfound authority. You thought you caught a cashier, but you actually captured the one person who spent every night studying your failures. My name is Maya Sterling, and I am no longer just a witness. I am the evidence. The legacy of the Ohio standstill lived on far beyond the headlines. Maya did not return to her role at Prime Foods as a victim, but she did return one last time to walk through the automatic doors. She greeted the customers who had filmed her arrest and thanked the manager who had tried to stand in the way of the agents. She had turned a moment of public humiliation into a catalyst for systemic change. By revealing her identity, she had bridged the gap between the voiceless and the powerful, proving that in the age of digital transparency, a hidden camera and a resilient spirit could bring even the most formidable federal fortress to its knees. Maya Sterling was no longer a name on a detention log. She was a landmark in American civil rights history, a living reminder that the truth, once recorded, can never be erased.